there was a time when crossing the edge of a forest was not considered an ordinary step. It was a crossing between two worlds. Across ancient Europe, countless communities shared a habit that seems almost impossible to understand today. Before anyone entered certain forests, they stopped. Some removed their hats. Some lowered their heads. Others whispered words so quietly that even the people standing beside them could not hear. A few left behind a piece of bread, a pinch of salt, or a small branch carefully placed upon a stone. To an outsider, these actions might have looked like harmless traditions or perhaps simple superstition. But to the people who performed them, they were neither. They believed these rituals mattered. Not because the forest belonged to them, but because they believed it belonged to something or someone else. Who, exactly, were they asking permission from? The answer is far more complicated than a single legend or a forgotten god. For thousands of years, forests shaped the lives of nearly every European community. They provided timber, food, medicine, and shelter. Yet they also concealed wolves, bandits, disease, and landscapes where a traveler could disappear without leaving a trace. In such places, survival depended as much on respect as on strength. Over time, practical caution blended with spiritual belief. The boundary between nature and the unseen became difficult to separate. What began as simple acts of humility slowly transformed into rituals passed from one generation to the next, each carrying the quiet warning that some places demanded more than courage before they would allow a person to enter. Tonight, we follow those forgotten footsteps. Not to prove that ancient forests were haunted. Not to decide whether old beliefs were true. But to understand why so many people, across so many different cultures, paused at the edge of the trees, and asked permission before taking a single step into the darkness. If we could travel back 1,000 years and stand beside a traveler approaching the edge of a European forest, the first thing we might notice is not the silence. It would be the hesitation. The trees themselves did not appear unusual. Towering oaks, dark pines, and tangled undergrowth stretched toward the horizon much as they do today. Birds sang above the canopy. Wind moved through the branches. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in scattered patches of gold. To modern eyes, it might seem like the perfect place for a peaceful walk. Yet to the people of ancient Europe, a forest was never simply a collection of trees. It was a place where the ordinary rules of human life no longer fully applied. Villages ended where the fields stopped. Beyond that invisible boundary lay a world shaped by different rhythms, one that no king truly ruled, no farmer completely understood, and no map could fully explain. Once a traveler stepped beneath the canopy, familiar landmarks quickly disappeared. Sounds echoed strangely between the trunks. A path that looked obvious in the morning could vanish by afternoon. Even experienced woodsmen admitted that the forest had a way of confusing those who entered it with too much confidence. For people whose lives depended on memory rather than modern navigation, becoming lost was not merely inconvenient. It could easily become fatal. But danger alone does not explain the deep respect forests inspired. Across Europe, from the mist-covered hills of the Celtic world to the vast woodlands inhabited by Germanic and Slavic communities, stories described forests as living places. Not alive in the way an animal is alive, but alive with presence. Ancient trees were believed to witness generations come and go. Springs hidden beneath roots were treated with unusual care. Certain clearings were approached with caution, not because anyone had seen monsters there, but because those places felt different, older somehow, as though they belonged to another order of existence. Many communities did not separate the natural world from the spiritual world as modern societies often do. A river was not merely water. A mountain was not merely stone. And a forest was never just wood and leaves. It was a landscape where memory, ancestry, and belief overlapped. Some traditions spoke of guardian spirits. Others imagined ancestral presences lingering among ancient groves. In certain regions, sacred trees became places where vows were sworn, disputes were settled, and offerings were quietly left behind. Although these beliefs differed from one culture to another, they shared a remarkable idea: entering the forest was not the same as entering an empty space. It was entering someone else's domain. That belief shaped behavior in subtle ways. Voices naturally became quieter. Children were warned not to shout. Hunters avoided unnecessary boasting before crossing the tree line. Even experienced travelers often paused for a brief moment before taking the first step, as though acknowledging an unseen threshold. To us, these actions might seem symbolic. To them, they were practical expressions of respect. But respect for whom? That question would become the foundation of one of Europe's oldest and most mysterious forgotten rituals. What happened next was rarely dramatic. There were no grand ceremonies. No crowds gathered beneath towering trees. No elaborate temples stood at the forest's edge. Instead, the ritual was often so simple that a stranger might not even notice it. A traveler would stop. Just for a moment. Sometimes they removed their hat. Sometimes they bowed their head ever so slightly. Others touched the bark of the nearest tree with the palm of their hand, as if greeting an old acquaintance. In a few regions, a small gift, a crust of bread, a handful of grain, or a pinch of salt was quietly placed on a stone or at the base of an ancient oak before anyone continued forward. Nothing was demanded in return. Nothing visible happened. And yet those few silent seconds were considered important enough to be repeated generation after generation. Why? No single answer exists, because Europe was never one culture. Celtic communities, Germanic tribes, Baltic peoples, and Slavic villages all developed their own customs over centuries. Their languages differed. Their gods differed. Their stories differed. But one remarkable pattern appears again and again. Before entering places believed to be ancient, powerful, or sacred, people acknowledged that they were guests. Not owners. Guests. In many traditions, the first step into the forest carried symbolic weight. It marked the moment when a person left behind the predictable world of fields, roads, and villages and entered a landscape where human control became uncertain. The ritual itself may have taken only a few seconds, but it reminded the traveler that confidence alone would not keep them safe. Humility might. Some old traditions describe whispered words whose exact forms have long been forgotten. Others mention brief blessings spoken under one's breath, asking for a safe journey and a peaceful return. In many cases, the words themselves mattered less than the act of speaking them. The ritual created a pause, a deliberate moment that separated ordinary life from whatever waited beyond the trees. Anthropologists often point out that human societies have long used rituals to mark transitions. Crossing a river. Entering a new home. Beginning a harvest. Burying the dead. These moments were rarely treated as ordinary because they represented a change in both place and state of mind. Stepping into a vast forest may have been one of the oldest transitions of all. Imagine leaving behind the voices of your village. Behind you were smoke rising from familiar rooftops, cultivated fields, and neighbors who knew your name. Ahead lay miles of woodland where every sound carried uncertainty. Every broken branch demanded attention. Every unfamiliar track in the mud could tell the story of an animal or another human you had not yet seen. In that moment, asking permission may have served another purpose. It slowed the traveler down. It reminded them to observe before acting. To listen before speaking. To notice the wind, the weather, the direction of light, and the countless details that might mean the difference between returning home, or never finding the path again. Perhaps that was the true power of the ritual. But if asking permission was considered so important, what happened to those who ignored it completely? That question appears again and again in the old stories, and the answers are far stranger than most people expect. The old stories rarely begin with monsters. Instead, they begin with ordinary people who believed they knew better. A hunter in a hurry. A merchant trying to reach the next village before nightfall. A young traveler eager to prove that old customs belong to an older generation. In countless tales passed down across Europe, these are the people who chose not to pause. They crossed the edge of the forest without a word, without a gesture, and without acknowledging the invisible boundary that everyone else respected. The stories that followed were not always spectacular. In fact, what makes them so unsettling is how ordinary they often seem. A path that had been walked 100 times suddenly appeared unfamiliar. Landmarks disappeared. The sound of running water came from the wrong direction. Birdsong stopped all at once, leaving behind a silence so complete that even experienced woodsmen felt uneasy. None of these events proved that anything supernatural had happened. Yet to the people telling these stories, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Again and again, misfortune seemed to follow those who entered the forest carelessly. Across parts of Central and Northern Europe, folklore speaks of travelers who wandered in circles despite believing they were walking in a straight line. Some claimed that the same fallen tree appeared again and again, no matter which direction they turned. Others insisted they could see the edge of the forest in the distance, only to discover hours later that they had never moved any closer. Modern readers might recognize these experiences as the disorientation that dense forests can naturally create. Without reliable landmarks, even skilled travelers can unknowingly walk in circles. Changes in weather, fading light, and physical exhaustion only make the problem worse. But centuries ago, people interpreted these moments differently. They believed the forest had refused to accept the traveler. Some traditions describe this as becoming taken by the woods, not necessarily carried away by a creature or a spirit, but caught in a place where ordinary human certainty no longer worked. The punishment was often confusion rather than violence. The forest did not attack. It simply refused to reveal the way home. One recurring theme appears in many regional traditions: arrogance. The person who became lost was often someone who laughed at old customs, mocked the warnings of elders, or entered the woodland believing that experience alone made them untouchable. Whether these stories reflected real events or served as moral lessons, their message remained remarkably consistent. Respect was considered a form of protection. Pride was considered a risk. There are also accounts of travelers who, after realizing they had become hopelessly disoriented, stopped walking altogether. Instead of forcing their way deeper into the trees, they quietly apologized aloud, left behind a small offering, and waited. Sometimes, according to the stories, they soon recognized a familiar landmark. Sometimes they heard the distant sound of church bells. Sometimes another traveler appeared from nowhere and led them safely back to the road. Whether these endings were shaped by faith, coincidence, or memory is impossible to know. What matters is that people remembered them and continued telling them for generations. But these stories raise an even deeper question. If the forest itself was not believed to be evil, then who or what was thought to deserve such respect? To answer that, we have to step beyond individual legends and into the ancient beliefs that shaped the spiritual landscape of Europe itself. To ask permission before entering a forest is to accept one remarkable idea: that the forest belongs to someone else. But who? The answer changes depending on where you stand in Europe, which century you choose, and whose stories you decide to follow. There is no single legend that explains every ritual, no universal belief shared by every ancient community. And that may be the most fascinating part of all. Although their names were different, many European cultures arrived at a surprisingly similar conclusion: forests were places where humans were visitors, not masters. Among the Celtic peoples, certain groves were regarded as sacred spaces. These were not simply beautiful places to admire. They were places where the boundary between the human world and the sacred seemed thinner. Ancient trees became witnesses to oaths. Clearings became gathering places for ceremonies. Some groves were approached with such reverence that cutting a tree without permission was considered far more than an act of destruction; it was a violation of something deeply respected. Further north, many Germanic traditions described forests as landscapes filled with unseen presences. These were not always frightening beings waiting to harm anyone who entered. More often, they represented forces that already belonged there long before villages, kingdoms, or borders existed. The forest had its own order, and wise people entered it with humility rather than ownership. Among Slavic traditions, dense woodlands often became settings where everyday life met the unknown. Stories spoke of ancient spirits, mysterious guardians, or places where travelers were expected to behave with unusual respect. These tales varied from region to region, but they shared a common lesson: those who treated the forest carelessly risked more than getting lost. They risked forgetting that they were only temporary guests in an older world. The Baltic peoples preserved similar ideas. Sacred trees, springs, and stones were often treated as places worthy of offerings or quiet prayers. Even after new religions spread across Europe, many local customs survived in subtle ways. A ribbon tied to a branch. A coin left beside a spring. A moment of silence before entering an old woodland. The names changed. The rituals changed. But the instinct remained. Modern historians and anthropologists find this pattern especially intriguing. Communities separated by mountains, rivers, languages, and centuries repeatedly developed customs that encouraged restraint before entering wild places. Some scholars see these rituals as expressions of environmental respect. Others interpret them as social traditions that taught caution in dangerous landscapes. Still others argue that sacred forests helped strengthen community identity by turning ordinary spaces into places of shared meaning. Perhaps each explanation contains part of the truth. After all, human beliefs rarely emerge from a single cause. A dangerous forest can inspire practical caution. Practical caution can become tradition. Tradition can become ritual. And ritual, repeated for generations, can become sacred. Yet one mystery still remains. If these customs were so deeply woven into daily life across much of Europe, why did so many of them gradually disappear? The answer lies not within the forests themselves, but in the dramatic transformation of Europe over the centuries, a transformation that changed not only its landscapes, but also the way people understood the unseen world. The rituals performed at the edge of Europe's forests did not vanish overnight. They faded slowly, almost imperceptibly, across generations. A whispered blessing became a family habit. A family habit became an old-fashioned custom. Eventually, many customs survived only as stories told by grandparents who could no longer explain exactly where they had come from. What changed? The forests were still there. The ancient trees still stood. The winding paths remained as confusing as ever. But Europe itself was changing. As kingdoms expanded, roads improved, and settlements pushed deeper into the wilderness, forests gradually became less mysterious than they had once seemed. Places that had once taken days to cross were now connected by trade routes. Monasteries appeared in remote regions. New villages were built where only woodland had existed before. The unknown slowly gave way to the familiar. At the same time, another transformation was unfolding. As Christianity spread across Europe over many centuries, older local traditions were increasingly viewed through a different spiritual lens. Many sacred groves lost their ceremonial role. Shrines disappeared. Some ancient gathering places were abandoned, while others were replaced by churches built nearby or directly upon sites that had already held deep meaning for local communities. Yet history is rarely a story of complete replacement. Old beliefs have a remarkable way of surviving beneath new ones. In many villages, people continued certain customs without fully remembering their original purpose. A traveler might still pause before entering the woods, but instead of addressing the unseen guardians described in older folklore, they quietly made the sign of the cross and asked for God's protection. The action remained. Only its meaning had changed. This blending of traditions fascinates historians because it reveals how cultures adapt rather than simply disappear. A ritual does not always die. Sometimes it changes language, symbols, or explanation while preserving its original emotional purpose. Respect. Humility. Awareness. Those values continued to matter even as the stories surrounding them evolved. Written records from the medieval period offer occasional glimpses of these older practices. Church authorities sometimes criticized local customs they considered remnants of earlier beliefs. Certain festivals, offerings at springs, or ceremonies beneath ancient trees were discouraged or reinterpreted. Yet the very fact that such warnings were recorded suggests these traditions remained widespread enough to attract attention. Archaeology tells a similar story. Across Europe, excavations have uncovered offerings placed in wetlands, near ancient trees, beside springs, and at the edges of woodlands. Coins, pottery, animal bones, tools, personal ornaments. None of these discoveries can prove that every object was left as part of a ritual asking permission to enter a forest. But together they reveal something undeniable. For thousands of years, many Europeans treated parts of the natural landscape as places worthy of reverence rather than simple resources. The forest was not merely used. It was approached. It was acknowledged. It was remembered. And perhaps that explains why echoes of these forgotten rituals can still be found today, not in ancient manuscripts alone, but in quiet habits that continue long after their original stories have faded. Because in some corners of Europe, people never completely stopped asking permission. They simply learned to do it in different ways. If these rituals truly belong to a distant past, we might expect them to have disappeared completely. But they haven't. Not entirely. Even today, scattered across Europe, small customs continue to survive, sometimes so quietly that the people practicing them no longer recognize them as echoes of something ancient. Walk through parts of Scandinavia, the Baltic countries, the Scottish Highlands, the Carpathian Mountains, or remote villages in Eastern Europe, and you may still encounter traditions that encourage respect before entering certain places. They are rarely described as ancient rituals anymore. Instead, they are remembered as family customs, local habits, or simple gestures passed down through generations. A grandparent might tell a child not to shout in the forest. A mushroom gatherer might quietly touch the first tree they pass. Someone else may leave the woodland exactly as they found it, believing it is bad luck to disturb more than necessary. To an outsider, these actions may seem insignificant. To the people who inherited them, they simply feel right. Anthropologists often describe traditions like these as cultural echoes, practices that survive long after their original meanings have faded. A community may forget the story that gave birth to a custom while continuing the custom itself because it has become woven into everyday life. This phenomenon is surprisingly common throughout human history. People celebrate festivals without remembering why they began. They repeat blessings whose oldest words have changed over centuries. They follow habits inherited from parents and grandparents without ever asking where those habits came from. Forest rituals may have followed the same path. Modern psychology offers another interesting perspective. Rituals, even simple ones, have measurable effects on human behavior. They encourage people to slow down. They increase attention. They reduce impulsive decisions during uncertain situations. Before entering an unfamiliar environment, a brief moment of intentional pause can sharpen awareness of sounds, weather, direction, and surroundings. In other words, what ancient people described as asking permission may also have functioned as an extraordinarily practical survival habit. The spiritual meaning and the practical benefit did not compete with one another. They reinforced each other. A person who believed the forest deserved respect was less likely to rush carelessly beneath its trees. Less likely to overlook changing weather. Less likely to ignore unfamiliar tracks. Less likely to become overconfident. Perhaps that is why similar customs appeared again and again across societies that had never met one another. Different languages. Different beliefs. Different histories. Yet remarkably similar lessons. Approach the unknown with humility. Do not assume that every place exists for your convenience. Understand where you are before deciding what to do. These ideas feel surprisingly modern. Today, hikers are taught to respect fragile ecosystems. Conservationists remind visitors to leave no trace. Park signs encourage people to stay on marked trails, avoid disturbing wildlife, and remember that nature is not simply scenery, it is a living system with its own balance. The language has changed. The philosophy has not. And perhaps that raises the most intriguing question of all. If so many ancient rituals disappeared, why did this one leave behind so many quiet echoes that we still recognize, even after centuries have passed? To answer that, we must look beyond the ritual itself and ask what it was truly trying to teach those who stood at the edge of the trees. At first glance, the ritual seems to be about the forest. A traveler stops. A few quiet words are spoken. Perhaps a small offering is left behind. Then the journey begins. For centuries, people assumed the purpose of these actions was to gain the favor of unseen powers that watched over the woodland. Some believed they were greeting guardian spirits. Others thought they were honoring ancestors, local deities, or sacred places whose names have long been forgotten. But what if the ritual was never meant to change the forest? What if it was meant to change the traveler? This possibility has become increasingly interesting to historians, anthropologists, and psychologists alike. Rituals often serve a purpose beyond the explanations people give for them. They shape behavior. They prepare the mind. They create a deliberate pause between one state of life and another. Standing at the edge of a forest was one of those moments. A person left behind certainty. Ahead lay uncertainty. The ritual transformed that simple step into a conscious decision. It reminded the traveler that confidence should never become arrogance, and that experience should never replace awareness. Ancient Europe was filled with landscapes capable of humbling even the most skilled hunter. A sudden storm could erase familiar tracks, thick mist could swallow entire valleys. Snow could hide dangerous ground. Dense woodland could distort distance and direction until even experienced people questioned their own senses. The ritual did not remove those dangers. It reminded people that the dangers existed. Perhaps that is why similar traditions appeared in places separated by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. Communities that never shared a language nevertheless reached remarkably similar conclusions about one simple truth. The natural world deserves respect. Not because it is cruel. Not because it is kind. But because it is indifferent. The forest does not change to accommodate those who enter it. People must change themselves instead. That idea feels surprisingly timeless. Modern mountaineers prepare carefully before climbing. Sailors study weather before leaving harbor. Divers check their equipment before entering the sea. Scientists follow strict procedures before conducting dangerous research. Each action begins with a ritual, not because the mountain, the ocean, or the laboratory demands it, but because the human mind benefits from a moment of intention before facing uncertainty. Perhaps the ancient forest ritual belonged to the same family of ideas. Its language was spiritual. Its effect may have been profoundly practical. And that may explain why it endured for so many centuries. Because beneath every whispered blessing, every bowed head, and every silent pause stood a lesson that never truly grows old. The world becomes far more dangerous the moment we believe it no longer deserves our respect. But there is still one final question. If these rituals have almost vanished from daily life, what, exactly, have we lost along with them? Today, most of us can enter a forest without giving it a second thought. We carry maps in our pockets. We navigate by satellite. We rarely believe that unseen guardians wait beyond the trees. In many ways, the world feels smaller, brighter, and easier to understand than it did 1,000 years ago. And yet, the feeling remains. There are still moments when a dense forest falls unexpectedly silent. When towering trees make us lower our voices without knowing why. When an ancient path inspires a sense of respect that has nothing to do with fear. Perhaps those moments are not reminders of forgotten spirits. Perhaps they are reminders of something within ourselves. The people of ancient Europe lived closer to landscapes that could both sustain and destroy them. Their rituals reflected a relationship built on humility rather than control, on observation rather than certainty. Whether they whispered to guardian spirits, honored their ancestors, or simply prepared themselves for the unknown, one truth quietly connected them all. Before entering a place greater than themselves, they paused. Not because they believed the forest needed their permission, but because they believed they needed to remember where they were. Maybe that is the oldest lesson hidden within this forgotten ritual. Respect is not always an offering to the world around us. Sometimes it is a reminder to ourselves. And perhaps that is why, after centuries of change, the ancient forests of Europe still invite us to do exactly what they asked our ancestors to do long ago. Stop, listen, and enter with humility.